She rode that ATV across my land every single week for 2.5 years. Through my backfield, across my garden corner, right past my fence line like my property was her personal off-road park. I asked nicely, I asked firmly, I sent letters, I filed complaints, I put up signs. She knocked the signs down, I put up rope barriers, she drove through them. So one weekend I called in every favor I had, rented the equipment I needed, and built something she could not drive through, could not knock down, and could not go around. And when she showed up on that ATV the following Saturday morning, she drove right up to the edge of what I had built, stopped, sat there on that machine for a long silent moment, and then turned around and went back the way she came. And she has never crossed my property line again. Not once. Not ever. My name is Thomas Garrett. I am 64 years old. I am a retired high school history teacher, and I own 11 acres of mixed land in rural western North Carolina, about 20 minutes outside of a small town called Waynesville. The property has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather bought it in 1951. My father grew up on it. I grew up spending summers and school breaks on it, fishing in the creek that runs along the eastern boundary, helping my grandfather stack firewood, learning the names of every tree and bird and stone formation on those 11 acres like I was memorizing a beloved book. When my grandfather died, he left the property to my father. When my father died 12 years ago, it came to me. I did not grow up to be a farmer. I spent 31 years in a classroom in Asheville teaching American history to 10th graders. But I always knew that land was mine, and I always knew that eventually, when I retired, I would go back to it. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. And when I retired at 62, that is exactly what I did. I moved into the old farmhouse, which I had been maintaining and gradually renovating over the years, and I settled into the life I had always intended to live. A garden, a small orchard of apple and pear trees my grandfather had planted, a woodshop in the outbuilding where I spent mornings making furniture, evenings on the porch watching the mountains go blue in the dusk. Quiet, purposeful, mine. My property sits at the end of a gravel road. There are only 3 other properties on that road before mine. The first 2 belong to families I have known for decades, the Pattersons and the Murphys, good people who have been on that road longer than I have. The third property, the one immediately adjacent to my western boundary, changed hands about 3 years ago. The previous owners, an older couple named the Hendersons, had kept chickens and a small vegetable operation and had been exactly the kind of rural neighbors you hope for, present enough to nod to, absent enough to leave you in peace. The new owners were a couple in their early 40s named Craig and Denise Varner. Craig worked remotely doing something with financial software. Denise was a dental hygienist who drove into town 3 days a week. They seemed pleasant enough when I introduced myself. They had 2 teenage boys and a lifestyle that I would describe as enthusiastically recreational. They bought the property because they wanted space to do outdoor things, hiking, target shooting, and as became apparent almost immediately, ATV riding. They had 2 ATVs, a large 4-wheel one for Craig and a slightly smaller one that the boys rode. Within the first month of moving in, they had established what they clearly considered an informal trail system across their own property. I saw them from my back fence sometimes, running the machines through their fields and tree lines, boys whooping, Craig following behind. It looked like they were having a wonderful time, on their own land, which is entirely their right and entirely their business. The problem started 8 weeks after they moved in. I was working in my back garden on a Saturday morning in late October, clearing out the summer annuals and turning the beds for winter, when I heard the ATV engine getting louder than it should have been, louder than it would be if it were on their property. I stood up and looked toward my western fence line. The fence at that point was an old post and wire agricultural fence, the kind that marks a boundary without creating much of a physical barrier. 3 strands of smooth wire strung between wooden posts, sufficient for keeping livestock contained, but not meaningful as an obstacle to a person or a vehicle determined to cross it. There was a gap in that fence, had been for years. One of the posts had leaned and the top wire had sagged. I had been meaning to fix it, but it had never been a priority because nothing had ever needed to be kept out. Through that gap came Craig Varner on his ATV, moving at a moderate speed across the corner of my back field, parallel to my fence line, cutting diagonally through about 40 feet of my property before exiting through another gap on the far side and rejoining what was apparently their intended trail route on my neighbor Patterson's access easement beyond. I watched this happen with the same mild disbelief I think most people feel the first time something clearly wrong occurs right in front of them. Not rage, just a moment of not quite believing what I was seeing. I walked to the fence line. Craig had already gone through. I waited. About 10 minutes later, he came back on the return loop. He saw me standing there. He slowed down and pulled up to the gap in the fence. He was cheerful about it, immediately and unguardedly cheerful, which told me he had not been trying to hide anything and had not anticipated that I would have any objection. He said, "Hey, how are you settling in? Great property you've got here." He said he hoped I didn't mind. They had just found that this little shortcut through the corner of my field saved them a big detour on the trail, and it wasn't like it was bothering anything. I told him, politely but plainly, that this was private property and that I would need him to stay on his own land. He looked mildly surprised. He said sure, no problem, he totally understood, he would find another route. He apologized in the easy, unbothered way of someone who expects the matter to be finished and who does not anticipate having to revisit it. I went back to my garden. I thought about fixing the fence gap that afternoon. I told myself I would get to it by end of week. I did not get to it by end of week. Life intervenes. There is always something else on a rural property. The wood stove chimney needed cleaning, the orchard needed late pruning, a section of roof flashing needed attention before the winter rains came. The fence gap stayed open. The following Saturday, I heard the ATV again. I walked to the back fence. Craig came through the gap exactly as he had the week before. Diagonal across my field corner, out through the far gap. He did not stop. He did not look toward me. He simply rode through as if the conversation the previous week had not happened or had not meant what I had clearly intended it to mean. I called to him. He either did not hear me over the engine or chose not to. He was through my property and gone in about 30 seconds. I fixed the fence gap that afternoon. I reset the leaning post with a new concrete footing. I restrung all 3 wire strands tight and added a 4th strand at the bottom. I cleared the brush on both sides of the fence so the line was clean and visible. It took me about 4 hours of solid work. I was 62 years old and fit for my age, but 4 hours of post resetting and wire stringing is not nothing. I was sore that evening. The following Saturday, I heard the engine again. I walked to the fence line. The wire was down on the top 2 strands at the point I had repaired, folded aside deliberately so the ATV could pass through. Craig came through at his usual moderate pace. He saw me standing there. He raised a hand in greeting. I did not raise my hand back. I walked to the fence after he had passed and looked at the wire. It had not been cut. It had been bent aside and would spring back when released. He had essentially treated my fence repair as a temporary inconvenience rather than a boundary. I called a fencing contractor the following Monday. I had a proper agricultural fence installed along my entire western boundary. 5-strand high tensile wire, steel T-posts every 8 feet, with 2 properly gated openings at the designated access points I used for my own equipment. The fence was not decorative. It was functional and substantial and clearly not accidental. The total cost was a little over $1,800. I paid it without pleasure, but without hesitation. I waited. The following Saturday came. I did not hear the ATV from my garden. I waited. No engine sound near my fence line. I walked back to look. The fence was intact. The Saturday after that, same, intact, silent. I thought the fence had resolved the situation. I allowed myself to feel the quiet satisfaction of a problem properly solved. 3 weeks passed, then a month, nothing. And then, on a Sunday morning, about 6 weeks after the fence installation, I was walking my eastern boundary checking the creek level. We had had heavy rain, and I wanted to make sure the bank was holding, when I came around the lower end of my property and saw something that stopped me cold. At the far southern corner of my land, where my property meets the old logging easement that runs behind 3 properties on our road, there was a new gap in my fence. Not a sagged post or a worn wire. A clean cut. 2 of the 5 strands had been snipped, the ends curled back neatly. Through that gap ran a fresh set of ATV tracks in the soft ground, coming in from the logging easement, crossing about 60 feet of my lower pasture, and exiting through a similar cut in the fence on the other side. He had cut my fence. I stood there looking at those cut wires for a long time. The creek was running loud behind me after the rain. The mountains were grey and close with cloud. I felt something that was colder and more absolute than anger. I felt the specific feeling of someone who has tried to be reasonable and has had their reasonableness taken for weakness. I went home, I got my phone. I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line and reported the property damage. A deputy came out that afternoon, looked at the cut wires, took photographs, took my statement. He told me that cutting someone's fence was criminal mischief under North Carolina law, a Class 1 misdemeanor, and that if I could demonstrate who had done it, there were grounds for citation or charge. He told me to document everything and contact them again if it continued. I also repaired the fence that same afternoon. The following Saturday, the fence was cut again, same location, same method. I reported it again, I repaired it again. I also installed a trail camera pointed at that section of fence, disguised in a tree hollow about 30 feet back. The image quality was good. The following Saturday, I reviewed the footage. Craig Varner, on his ATV, wire cutters in hand, cutting my fence with the casual efficiency of someone who has decided that the path of least resistance is simply to keep doing what he wants to do until the other person gives up. I had the footage, I had the deputy's reports, I had documented dates and photographs going back to the first incident. I consulted a property attorney named William Doss, who had an office in Waynesville and who had handled rural property disputes in western North Carolina for over 20 years. William reviewed everything I brought him and told me I had a very strong civil case for property damage, trespass, and nuisance. He sent a formal cease and desist letter to Craig and Denise Varner by certified mail. Craig received the letter. I know this because the certified mail return receipt came back signed in his handwriting. The following Saturday, he cut my fence again. I reported it to the sheriff. The deputy was now familiar with my address. I got the impression he was not surprised. He told me that a citation had been issued to Craig Varner for the previous incidents and that further violations would likely result in a court summons. He seemed like a man who dealt with rural neighbor disputes frequently and who had a clear understanding of the pace at which such things resolve themselves, which is to say, slowly and not without escalation. That evening I sat on my porch and did the thing I had been avoiding doing for the past several months, which was genuinely confront the fact that legal processes and fence repairs were not going to solve this problem. They were managing it, they were documenting it, they were creating a record, but they were not stopping it. Because Craig Varner had decided, at some point, that he was simply going to keep doing what he was doing until I either gave up or the legal consequences caught up with him in a way he could not ignore. And the legal consequences in a rural county for a first-time misdemeanor fence cutter were moving at the speed of paperwork. I needed a solution that did not depend on Craig deciding to stop. I needed a solution that made continuing physically impossible. I walked my western and southern fence lines the next morning with my notebook and my measuring tape. I walked slowly. I looked at the terrain. I thought about the problem the way I used to think about difficult historical questions in the classroom, not from the perspective of what should have happened, but from the perspective of what would actually work given the constraints and geography of the situation. What I was looking for was a solution that was entirely on my own property, entirely legal, entirely permanent, and entirely insurmountable to an ATV, not a fence. He had proven he was willing to cut fences, not a barrier he could go around, not a gate he could wait for me to leave open, something that would end the question definitively and without ongoing maintenance. I found my answer in the terrain itself. Along my southern property line, running roughly parallel to the fence for most of its length, there was a natural drainage swale, a low channel that collected runoff from the upper pasture and directed it toward the creek. In dry weather, this swale was a modest depression about 18 inches deep and 3 feet wide, manageable on foot, passable with care in a vehicle. But it ran the entire length of the southern boundary, and it was mine. Entirely mine. And what I had in my mind was a way to use it. I called my friend Leon Briggs. Leon was a retired contractor who had spent 40 years building things in these mountains and who now spent most of his time doing small projects for neighbors and friends because he was, as he put it, constitutionally incapable of being idle. I had helped Leon reshingle his barn roof 2 summers ago. He had helped me pour the footings for my woodshop addition the summer before that. We were the kind of neighbors who kept a running, informal account of favors owed and rendered. I described what I had in mind. Leon listened without interrupting, which was his way. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "So you want to dig it out and build it up?" I said yes, that was exactly what I wanted to do. He said he had an excavator he could bring over on Saturday and that we could probably knock out the earthwork in a day if we started early. I said that worked for me. I also called my neighbor Patterson, whose access easement bordered my southern property, and explained the situation. Patterson had actually seen the ATV cutting through my land several times from his own property and was entirely sympathetic. He had no objections to anything I was doing on my side of the line. What I built was this. I deepened and widened the drainage swale along the entire southern boundary, from a modest depression to a proper drainage channel 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide, with gently sloped sides faced with large flat fieldstone that I sourced from the stone piles my grandfather had cleared from the fields decades ago. On the inner bank of the channel, the side facing my pasture, I built a raised berm using the excavated earth, compacted and seeded with a deep-rooting grass mix that would lock it in place permanently. The berm rose about 2.5 feet above the original grade, creating a total elevation change from the top of the berm to the bottom of the channel of nearly 7 feet. No ATV can cross a 7-foot drop into a 4-foot wide stone-lined channel. Not safely, not without being a very different kind of machine, and certainly not by simply driving through it the way you drive through a wire fence. Along the western boundary, where the original fence violations had begun, I reinforced the existing high-tensile fence with a line of native shrubs planted on the inside: hawthorn and wild rose, species that are beautiful in bloom and thoroughly impenetrable when mature. They were not mature yet, but they would be. I planted them in a dense double row at 18-inch spacing. In 3 years, they would be an 8-foot wall of thorns that nothing on wheels would voluntarily approach. The entire project took 3 weekends. Leon ran the excavator for the earthwork. I did the stone facing and the berm seeding myself. My neighbor Murphy came over one Saturday and helped me plant the shrub line, which went faster with 2 people working. When it was done, I walked the full length of what we had built and felt the specific satisfaction of permanence. Not a repair that could be undone, not a barrier that could be cut. Landform, stone, living root systems. Things that answered not to Craig Varner's wire cutters, but to geology. The Saturday after I finished, I was in my woodshop in the morning when I heard the ATV. I heard it approach from the direction of the Varner property. I heard it slow. I heard it stop. I heard the engine idle for a long moment. Then I heard it rev and move, the sound shifting as it traveled along my fence line, apparently looking for the alternate access point. Then the engine slowed again, stopped again, idled. Then it turned around and went back. I went back to the chair leg I was turning on the lathe. That was 14 months ago. In 14 months, Craig Varner has not crossed my property line once. The shrub line along the western fence is establishing well. By next year, the hawthorns will be dense enough to discourage any approach. The drainage channel along the southern boundary has, in addition to its ATV deterring function, significantly improved the drainage on my lower pasture, which had always been somewhat soggy in wet weather. The fieldstone facing looks beautiful. It looks like something that has been there for decades, like something my grandfather might have built. Last spring, I planted a row of daffodil bulbs along the top of the inner berm. They came up in March in a long golden line, and I stood at the edge of my pasture and looked at them and felt something that was not triumph exactly. Something quieter, something that had to do with land and time and the particular satisfaction of having added something permanent and good to a piece of ground that 3 generations of my family have loved. The legal matter with Craig Varner eventually resolved through the civil process. William Doss filed suit for the accumulated property damage and trespass. The Varners settled out of court for an amount that covered my fence installation costs and the fencing contractor I had called, with some amount remaining beyond that. Craig did not apologize directly. He sent a check. I cashed it. That was sufficient. We do not speak. When I drive past their property on the way to the road, I sometimes see Craig outside. We do not wave. We do not make eye contact. We have the particular relationship of two people who have each decided that the other is not worth the energy of either hostility or friendliness, and that the cleanest solution is simple mutual invisibility. I am at peace with that. I did not move to these 11 acres to make new friends. I moved here to live in the way I had always intended, on land my family had held for 3 generations, in the quiet of the mountains, doing the things that matter to me. Last fall, I finished a dining table in my woodshop. Black walnut, hand-planed, drawknife mortise and tenon joints, finished with Danish oil. It took me 6 months of weekend mornings. It is the finest piece of furniture I have ever made. It now sits in my kitchen, where I eat every meal and read every evening, and where I sometimes sit with coffee before dawn when the mountains are just outlines against the dark sky, and the creek is loud with rain, and everything is exactly as it should be. On the wall behind the table, there is a framed photograph of my grandfather standing in the back pasture of this property in 1962. He is squinting into the sun. He is wearing work clothes. He has his hands in his pockets, and he is looking at something in the middle distance with the expression of a man who knows exactly where he stands and has no doubt that this is where he belongs. I look at that photograph every morning. I think he would have approved of the drainage channel. I think he would have approved of the daffodils. I think he would have said, "The land takes care of itself when you take care of the land." He would have been right. He usually was.